A warm welcome to this talk, and I'm delighted to welcome Mr. Julian Gillespie all the way from Sydney. Julian, welcome.
It's a great pleasure to be with you, Dr. Campbell.
Yep. Now, you're a former barrister, and you've been doing one heck of a lot of legal work and digging around over the past few years. And we're going to talk about that in some detail, but why should people watch this video? What is interesting about it and what is important about it?
It's the subject matter that's interested you enough to ask me to come onto your show, and we regard it as probably the best kept secret by government globally at this point, with respect to particularly the modRNA vaccines, as they're called. Of course, we don't believe they're vaccines. In most jurisdictions globally, they actually fall under the legal definitions for being properly described as genetically modified organisms, or GMOs. And that's the little secret which just about every government that rolled those particular drugs out has withheld from their populations. And that's what we've been in the courts dealing with here in Australia, and what we've exposed as relevant legislation affecting UK citizens, European Union citizens, and US citizens, as well as South African citizens. All of those countries have legislation which deem these products to be GMOs, but they didn't go through the proper regulatory processes, and so that little secret was withheld from populations who asked to receive these.
So the vaccines can actually, by legal definitions, are legally defined as genetically modified organisms, and that's got massive implications in Australia, the UK, the United States, everywhere. So absolutely vital. Just tell us, if you don't mind, Julian, what got you interested in this and what you've been doing for the past few years working on it.
Well, it all arose in 2021 when I heard politicians, of all people, who aren't qualified medical practitioners in most instances, repeatedly calling upon these drugs as being safe and effective, safe and effective, safe and effective. And I said, well, hold on a second. You keep saying they're novel and new drugs. How do you know they're safe and effective? But moreover, with a bit of science background, I understood that they were developed from the original Wuhan strain from early 2020. However, we were in 2021, and the SARS-CoV-2 virus had altered drastically over that period of time to be many variants into the future. And my first prickling was like, well, hold on, nobody walks into a doctor's surgery in 2021 and asks to receive the flu shot that was distributed in 2019. So I already knew that the 2021 version of these so-called vaccines was already way out of date, because the variants had, propelled themselves into, we were nearly into Delta just before Omicron. And it's like, well, why are you asking people to take a vaccine for an old virus when we're up to many variants subsequent? And then there was just the discovery that this was an entirely new biologics platform that was being used in these drugs that had never been used before for any form of vaccination, let alone on a population scale. And this particular biologics technology or platform, the modRNA LNP complexes, had only been used in what's called a bespoke situation for persons who were essentially had run out of all options, had dire health issues, so they were looking death in the face, and they would go to specialists using these. Moderna was the one who was trying to do this before COVID, who would make very particular individualized injections for terminally ill patients. Very, very risky. Most of those patients, I knew from very quick research, subsequently died, a lot of them from complications. The risks of using this technology. And so there we had the Australian government and ministers without medical qualifications saying safe and effective. And so again, with that science background, we started scratching around, and I looked at the relevant Therapeutic Goods Act for the approval for these drugs in this country. And I realized that, well, hold on, the Therapeutic Goods Administration has invalidly approved these drugs. And we had a situation of essentially illegally approved drugs going out into the community that needed to be challenged. So that resulted in us bringing first the AVN proceedings in the federal court against our Secretary of Health. That ended prematurely because the court used an unreal technicality to stop the proceedings moving forward. That was with respect to standing. The court saying we didn't have legal standing. So there we had walked into the court with this mountain of evidence weighing us down in one hand, showing unprecedented deaths and injuries in this country from the rollout of these drugs. We had more injuries and deaths from these COVID drugs in 2021 than in the preceding 50 years of all traditional vaccines in Australia. That's incredible. In 1 year, more deaths and more injuries from one type of drug than 50 years of prior vaccines. And so you talk about a safety signal. So we were there in the court saying, look, we've got all these people dying. We need to show the court that the decision approving them is legally challengeable, and the court should declare that, yes, these should never have been approved. And it was remarkable, John, because we had this weighty evidence, all from experts, doctors and statisticians, professionals, and yet the court wanted to have us all concentrate on this legal standing thing, saying legal standing is important, legal standing is important. And we're trying to say, well, no, it's actually not. The deaths and injuries we're talking about are the important thing. But this was this legal fiction, Alice in Wonderland, that we were, garden path, we were taken down by the federal court. So we stopped those proceedings. And very quickly, there was an emerging new approval for babies of the same drugs. And the approval was being extended to Moderna. So we started what's called the Australian babies case. This time we went to the High Court, the highest court in Australia. And the first thing we said to the High Court, listen, the federal court has got a bee in its bonnet about this legal standing issue. It wants to waste all of our time on legal standing, yet we're here with now a wheelbarrow of evidence with respect to deaths and injuries, and we are telling you, High Court, this is a situation of preventable deaths and injuries. Let's get rid of this legal standing fiction and look at the actual evidence. The High Court had the temerity to turn around and tell us essentially, we don't think this is a good use of our resources. And so we're not going to listen to you. Go back to the federal court. And so we realized then that there was a fix on, as they say, that the federal court, and now with the assistance of the High Court, was protecting the Secretary of Health. Because by this stage, millions of these doses had been rolled out into the community. So we're talking about massive legal liability area here, that were we to have what's called our day in court to present that wheelbarrow of evidence, then the court would have been in the corner of having to say, Secretary of Health, it does appear that you illegally approved these drugs, illegally. And so we are going to rescind those approvals and no more of these drugs can go out into the community. Now, of course, if the court made that declaration and the rest of the Australian community heard it, they would have said, hold on, you've just been mandating and coercing us for the past over 12 months now to take these things at all costs. And you were telling us they're safe and effective, and now you're telling us that the court has sanctioned those approvals as illegal. So this is why, in my view and the view of many others, that the court has broken what's called the separation of powers doctrine here. It has gone out to protect the executive government. The executive government has oversight of the Department of Health. So that's a pretty steep curve to try and climb when the High Court's telling you to go away. But during all that work, particularly the Australian babies case, I had cause to return to what's called the Gene Technology Act. One of my colleagues in the background, who's highly credentialed in the sciences, I'll just put it in those terms so I don't identify the person, did suggest these things are gene therapies. They're gene therapies. And this person was well positioned to know, having all the right qualifications in that particular area of science. I'll just say that. And so I finally circled back to the Gene Technology Act, and it was a difficult read for me, even as a lawyer, because it was just so heavily science-laden. But I threw myself into it, and I emerged probably 3 or 4 weeks later, and I said to my legal colleagues, I said, hell, these are in fact not just gene therapies, they're genetically modified organisms. So then we worked with PhDs in molecular biology, going through the legal definitions of what determines a product to be a GMO in this country. And when we stepped through the legal definitions with the PhDs with the proper credentials, they sat back and they went, hell, you're right. These things are GMOs. They're very clearly and easily understood to be GMOs. What's gone wrong here? These things should have gone through not the TGA first. They were meant to go to the Office of the Gene Technology Regulator here in Australia and submit an application, quite simply, for a GMO license, a genetically modified organism license. Now, that might be startling and seem surreal and unreal to a lot of your viewers here today, but it's not. If people went and did a bit of inquiry, they'll find, for instance, in Australia, we all know AstraZeneca was a third product for this COVID, SARS-CoV-2 thing. AstraZeneca did go to the Office of the Gene Technology Regulator in Australia and did apply for a GMO license, went through an extensive risk assessment and risk management plan process, and in the result, the Office of the Gene Technology Regulator gave AstraZeneca a GMO license. Now, with that license, then AstraZeneca could approach the Therapeutic Goods Administration in Australia and seek provisional approval of its COVID drug. If any doctors, Australian doctors out there, have any old products in the back of their fridge, if they go and look at the product insert or the product information contained within the AstraZeneca box, it will have very clearly written at the top, genetically modified organism. They did not mention that to the Australian public. It was not broadcast, even though the risk assessment process conducted by called the OGTR, Office of the Gene Technology Regulator, the risk assessment process did the proper thing and put it out to public consultation. And so when you look at that final determination by the OGTR, you will see this very extensive section where public submissions were received and considered by the OGTR before that GMO license was granted. Now, we can say in hindsight, 2020, that GMO license should never have been provided for AstraZeneca to proceed, because very shortly after the TGA approved the drug and it was deployed into the community, many people died of blood clots, and subsequently that drug was restricted to the use. I don't know why they came up with this figure, but for persons only 50 years and older. Anyway, that's a story. What we have with Pfizer and Moderna is almost exactly the same mechanism of action for fulfilling the legal definitions of what is a genetically modified organism in this country. And that is simply, it's really 3 criteria. It's very straightforward, and we'll probably get to it in your notes in a moment, John. But first of all, it has to be any, that word's very important, any biological entity, any. Because you've got that word any there in a legal definition, it means anything, any biological entity. The second portion is capable of transferring genetic material. You say, okay, well, what's the any biological entity? You've got the modRNA in both the Moderna and Pfizer products, so that my fist there is a clump of genetic material. The modRNA, modified RNA. It's synthetic RNA. There's nothing natural about the RNA in either of those drug products.
Yeah.
And in the manufacture process, it's combined with LNPs, lipid nanoparticles. The lipid nanoparticles completely encapsulate the modRNA to protect it after it's injected, so it can travel through, biodistribute throughout the body, and it goes indeed to the brain, testes, ovaries, liver, hearts, lung, goes everywhere. So it safely gets it through the bloodstream, so it doesn't undergo attack and get disintegrated, and then it presents it to cells in all of those organs that I mentioned. The lipid nanoparticle has basically a chemistry affinity with the cell membrane of all cells within our bodies, right? The lipid nanoparticles is a type of fat that they both sort of share. That lipid nanoparticle envelope around the mRNA allows this whole complex to transfect or move across the cell membrane. So from out of the bloodstream to across the cell membrane and inside the cell. And once it's inside the cell, the lipid nanoparticle comes away and the modRNA is free to move within inside the cell in the cytoplasm. Now, let's just go back to that definition. Capable of transferring genetic material. What I've just described there is the physical transportation of the modRNA LNP complex through the blood, comes to a cell, transfects across the membrane, delivers genetic cargo inside the cell. That's a capable of transferring. The transfer is just the physical transferring throughout the body and into the cells and into the cytoplasm. So we've met the second part of the definition. The third part is that genetic material was created by recombinant technology. That's not a biggie here, because both companies, in all of the applications globally, very, very clearly say our product contains modified nucleosides. Modified nucleosides. Now, you can only modify nucleosides using what's called recombinant technology, and that is the creation of synthetic modified RNA. That is not natural. They create it wholly in the lab. That's the recombinant technology. So all three elements have been established in this country. It was established for AstraZeneca, and Pfizer and Moderna met the same three, ticked off the same three boxes. But inexplicably, they didn't pound on the door of the OGTR and ask to submit an application for a GMO license back in 2020.
This is the Office for Gene Technology.
That's correct, like AstraZeneca did. Now, we've brought our third set of proceedings, is again in the federal court, and this time, instead of wasting any further time trying to challenge the Secretary of Health, we're going directly against Pfizer and Moderna for their failure to obtain those GMO licenses, because they've always required them, just like AstraZeneca. And indeed, in this country, to in any way dealing means manufacture or importing and or transporting and or storing and or disposing of a genetically modified organism. Any one of those types of dealings, or altogether or a portion of them, requires a GMO license. And so there's been this continuous stream, of course, of the product ever since it was released onto the market here in February of 2021, of those various forms of dealing. And none of them have been performed with anyone holding a GMO license. Now, if you deal with a GMO in this country without a GMO license, you're committing what's called, at law, a serious criminal offence. Now, as soon as you see serious in front of criminal offence in this country or any other common law country, that means it's a biggie. It's a very serious thing that they're doing here. Now, we've been in the Federal Court of Australia since last year, and part of the papers that we were returned, that you see, various sorts of forms of discovery. We haven't had a lot of deep discovery at this point in time, but one of the documents produced by Pfizer evidences the fact that Pfizer did, in fact, go and knock on the door of the gene technology regulator here in Australia, yes, around about the third quarter of 2020. And for some reason, the gene technology regulator within the OGTR, then Dr. Raj Buehler, who is still holding that position, said to Pfizer, you boys are all right. If you have any further information, come back to me. But at this point in time, just go straight to the TGA. Now, she had no legal basis to do that whatsoever. And ever since we discovered these products are GMOs, she's been on the hop trying to cover her tracks, essentially. And her office has made overt, just public statements, almost, press releases, which can't really be challenged. They're just, it's her just throwing out her opinion. And on the public side with these press releases, she very boldly says, oh, these drugs, never required GMO licenses. And it's like, well, hold on. We're in court challenging that directly, yet she's putting out these public statements, trying to get in front of public opinion. Yet, I think you've met before in our country, Senator Gerard Rennick. He's been one of our outstanding senators in the Commonwealth Parliament who's been pushing back on these drugs for several years now, together with Malcolm Roberts, Ralph Babette, and a few others. Now, Gerard Rennick had the opportunity of requesting Dr. Raj Buehler, as the gene technology regulator, appear before what's called a Senate Estimates Committee. That's where senators get to grill Commonwealth bureaucrats to see if they're actually doing their job for the money that they're provided every single year. And they can ask any question that they want, really. It's quite the opportunity to cross-examine like we see in court proceedings, but even with more license at times. Now, back on 26 October of last year, 2023, just before, we're talking about 10 minutes before midnight, before the whole day's proceedings had to come to an end, Gerard Rennick managed to get Dr. Buehler into that chair and to undergo questions. Everyone was tired, and she finally slipped up. And she admitted, it's on video, it's on the Substack that we'll look at later, where she admitted that indeed these products involve a step in genetic modification in their manufacture. But then she boldly went on to say, oh, but that occurred overseas, and so we didn't have to regulate that. Okay? It's like, well, that was the way that it was a bit of sleight of hand. It's like, well, that's correct. Pfizer and Moderna wouldn't have needed to apply for a GMO license with respect to the manufacturing part of the dealing, because that was wholly offshore. But Raj, what about when they went to import those things and then transport them around the country and have them stored variously and then subsequently disposed? She didn't go on to talk about that aspect of her office being required to regulate Pfizer and Moderna, aka Moderna and Pfizer needed to come to her office and say, we're manufacturing overseas, you can't touch us, but we need to bring this stuff into the country, so we need a GMO license, please. She didn't go on to talk about that. That's where she's on the run almost in public relations terms, because all of those subsequent steps were undeniably her jurisdiction, the mandate of her office to oversee, govern, regulate, and to do so before Pfizer and Moderna could possibly approach the TGA for those provisional approvals, which finally released the products to the rest of the community. So unfortunately, that's the not short or not even long version of the backstory that you requested a few moments ago. But here we find ourselves now. And just to anticipate what we're going to discuss, what we discovered in Australia with these GMO laws, we said, heck, these are very, very sophisticated, very articulate, very refined GMO laws in this country under our Gene Technology Act. Where did the Australians get, the knowledge to create this act back in 2000? That would have required, the 1990s, a lot of thinking about creating our Gene Technology Act here. So we undertook legal research into South Africa, the United Kingdom, the European Union, Canada, and the US to see if there was anything else like our legislation there. And indeed there is. Almost word for word, John. In South Africa, almost exactly the same legal definitions. We go into the United Kingdom, almost word for word, exactly the same legal definitions. Same all across the European Union, almost exactly the same legal definitions. Canada, unfortunately, has nothing. They only regulate GMOs and plants, but we found by a different route the same GMO concerns also in the US. And so then we sat back and went, holy crap, all of those jurisdictions except for Canada knew all these things as well at the same time that these products were being deployed universally around the world. And we've got all this flouting of the law going on from one jurisdiction to another. This is what we're going to talk about further. And the ramifications of that are extraordinary, because we've heard so many times the issue of informed consent. That is, providing patients with all the information necessary so they can perform that last moment risk-benefit assessment of whether or not they're going to receive something into their body. Now, we know there was plenty of failings on so many issues by doctors and health practitioners globally when it came to so much information with respect to these novel and never before used technologies. But one issue which resonates with a lot of people, no matter what sort of scientific background they've got, when you mention genetically modified organism, that strikes a bell for everyone. What? Hold on. Tell me more, doctor. What is this thing? A GMO? And this is exactly what we're trying to raise with these proceedings and this discussion, to say this isn't just isolated in Australia. This has occurred globally, and this is why so many politicians have been running from the issue, because they do not want to be seen as the late messenger for all of the world's patients who receive these things, to say, there's something your doctor didn't tell you. And sorry, your doctor didn't actually know because your health regulator didn't tell them, but you've received a GMO, and that very well could have genetic consequences.